Have you ever been handed a deeply unfair no? Like, I want you to really just sit with that for a second.
Yeah, it's a rough feeling.
Right. Think about a time you were passed over for a job,
Right.
one you were absolutely perfect for. Or maybe you were rejected from a program or a loan or even an apartment.
And the reason has nothing to do with you.
Exactly. The reason they gave you had absolutely nothing to do with your qualifications, zero to do with your skills, your resume, your work ethic. It was just this flat, arbitrary, immovable no based entirely on who you are.
Which is incredibly specific.
It's this hollow feeling, isn't it?
It really is. It's a profound kind of powerlessness. I mean, when a rejection is based on merit, like, say you didn't have enough experience or your test scores were too low, you can internalize that.
Sure, you can fix that.
Right. You tell yourself to go back, study longer, work harder, try again. The path forward is pretty clear. But when a rejection is based on an immutable characteristic, the psychology of it is entirely different.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It is. The door isn't just closed. It feels like the door has been, well, completely bricked over. There's no amount of hard work you can do to change a demographic reality.
Bricked over. That's the perfect way to describe it. And usually, when we think about how that brickwork gets dismantled, how monumental civil rights laws are actually made, we tend to imagine this incredibly sterile, top-down process.
Like a bunch of politicians in a room.
Exactly. Some mahogany-paneled room in Washington. We picture them looking at abstract theories of justice, philosophizing about equality, and just drafting documents from the mountaintop. But the reality of how the modern American educational system was forced open is entirely different.
Very different.
Today on our deep dive, we are looking at a piece of civil rights legislation that was forged entirely out of stacked up, lived humiliations. It was a grassroots rebellion built from the ground up, brick by brick, rejection by people who were just sick of staring at brick walls.
And we should probably establish exactly what we're talking about right at the top. We're mapping the creation of Title IX.
Which is huge.
It is. It's arguably the most consequential education law passed in the 20th century. And surprisingly, it's astoundingly brief. It's exactly 37 words long.
Let's actually read those words because I think it's wild how much power is packed into a single sentence.
Go for it.
Okay, here is the entire text of the core provision. Quote, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." End quote. That's it. 37 words.
It's really a masterpiece of legislative efficiency. But the mission of our deep dive today is to explore the mechanics of how those words actually came to exist.
Right. Where did they come from?
Exactly. We're going to chronologically map how a chain of deeply personal grievances, specifically a denied academic promotion, somewhere between a dozen and 20 medical school rejection letters, and the daily grinding frustrations of female lawmakers. How all of that evolved into a unified national law.
So we're looking at the people behind it.
Yes. We are going to profile the specific founders of this movement. Bernice Sandler, Edith Green, Patsy Mink, and Birch Bayh, alongside the feminist networks that back them up.
Because, this wasn't just a spontaneous realization by the government that the system was broken. Nobody woke up in D.C. one day and said, you know what, we should probably be fair to women.
If only it worked that way.
Right. This was a calculated, strategic dismantling of the status quo. And to understand how you dismantle a system, you really have to look at the people who found the cracks in the foundation. We have to start with the spark.
The initial match.
Yes, and in this history, the match was struck in 1969 by a woman named Bernice "Bunny" Sandler. Let's set the scene here. It's the late 60s. She's at the University of Maryland. She's a psychologist, and she is teaching part-time.
And we need to understand the academic hierarchy here, Teaching part-time, being an adjunct, is an incredibly precarious position.
You're doing all the work.
You're doing the heavy lifting of instruction, yes. But you have no job security, lower pay, and zero institutional power. The ultimate goal, obviously, is to secure a full-time tenure-track position.
Exactly. And Sandler is perfectly positioned for one of those. There are 7 full-time openings in her department. So she applies, she has the doctorate, she's already doing the work, teaching the classes, interacting with the students. And yet, she is passed over. She gets the no.
The unfair no.
Right. But she doesn't just accept it and walk away. She goes to a faculty friend, a male colleague, and she asks why. Why didn't she get one of the 7 slots? And this colleague, with a level of casual honesty that is just like almost hard to fathom today, tells her that her qualifications are excellent. Merit is not the issue.
What?
But he says, quote, let's face it, you come on too strong for a woman.
Wow. Let's just unpack the sheer weight of that statement. Sandler later called those the 5 words that created turtlenecks. Because in the broader landscape of discrimination law, the absolute hardest thing to prove is intent.
No, for sure. They never just tell you.
Exactly. Institutions are savvy. They hide behind vague, subjective language. They'll tell you that you weren't a, quote, culture fit, or that they decided to go in a different direction, or maybe they needed a different kind of leadership style.
But this wasn't vague. This was the quiet part said entirely out loud into a megaphone. It was an explicit admission that the barrier was her gender.
Precisely. Her colleague basically handed her the blueprint of the invisible wall she was hitting. And from a psychological perspective, being told that your competence, your intellect, and your strength are actually liabilities simply because of your sex, that is a profoundly radicalizing moment.
I can't even imagine.
It forces you to realize that playing by the rules is pointless if the rules are rigged against your biology.
It's infuriating. Like, if a man is strong and assertive in a faculty meeting, he's a leader. He is a visionary. If a woman does the exact same thing, she's too strong.
It's a classic double standard.
But this is where Sandler separates herself from history, I think. She didn't just go home and vent to her friends over coffee. She didn't just write an angry letter to the dean and leave it at that. She got to work hunting for a legal hook.
Do you want to leverage?
Yes. She realized that if the university system was going to lock her out based on arbitrary rules, she needed to find a rule of her own, a bigger, heavier rule to break the lock.
And the place she finds this rule is just a testament to how meticulous she was. She started digging into, of all things, federal bureaucratic codes.
Just reading the fine print.
Literally reading the fine print. And she unearthed something called Executive Order 11246. President Lyndon B. Johnson had signed this back in 1965.
Okay, wait, stop right there. I need to push back on this, or at least ask for a translation here. An executive order from 1965 regulating federal contractors. Like, if I'm listening to this right now, I'm trying to figure out how a rule meant for companies pouring concrete for interstate highways or manufacturing boots for the military has anything to do with a part-time psychology professor at the University of Maryland. What is the mechanism there?
That is the exact mechanical puzzle that Sandler solved. You have to trace the legal evolution. The original 1965 order, 11246, was a powerful civil rights tool. It stated that if you did business with the federal government, if you held a federal contract, you could not discriminate in employment based on race, color, religion, or national origin.
So trying to enforce integration.
Exactly. It was a way to use the massive purchasing power of the federal government to enforce integration. But, crucially, in 1965, that order did not mention sex.
Right, it left women completely unprotected.
But then, a subsequent order changed the game. Executive Order 11375 took effect in 1968, and it amended the original directive. It did one very specific, monumental thing. It added the word sex to the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination for federal contractors.
Okay, so now federal contractors cannot discriminate against women. But I still have the exact same question.
How does it apply to a college?
Yes. Sandler is teaching psychology in a classroom. She's not building a nuclear submarine. How is a university a federal contractor?
This was her brilliant insight. Sandler looked at the financial architecture of American higher education. What actually funds a major university?
Tuition, mostly.
You'd think so, but it's not just tuition. It is massive influxes of federal grant money. Think about it. The Department of Defense funds engineering and physics research. The National Institutes of Health funds biology and medical research. The Department of Energy funds infrastructure.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Right. So by receiving and executing those millions of dollars in federal research grants, colleges and universities were legally classified as federal contractors. They signed contracts with the government to deliver research.
Which means
they were legally bound by Executive Order 11375.
That is absolutely wild. It's like finding a trapdoor in the legal code that nobody realized was there.
She found the vulnerability.
She really did. She looked at the entire ivory tower and realized, wait a minute, you all take government money to run your labs? That means you all have to play by the Department of Labor's rules.
Yeah.
So suddenly that offhand comment in the faculty lounge, you come on too strong for a woman, isn't just a sexist insult anymore.
It's actionable.
It is a documented violation of a federal executive order.
She transformed a localized personal slight into a massive jurisdictional vulnerability for the entire university. But, as anyone who has ever dealt with bureaucracy knows, having a legal theory and actually enforcing it are two entirely different realities.
A theory doesn't change anything on its own.
Right. A single part-time professor pointing at an executive order is just going to get ignored by university lawyers. They'd bury her in paperwork. To make the federal government care, she needed scale.
She needed backup.
She needed an undeniable volume of evidence, and she needed an organized vehicle to deliver the blow.
Which brings us to the logistics of what she actually did next, which just blows my mind. She teams up with an organization called the Women's Equity Action League, or WEAL.
A crucial partnership.
And on January 31st, 1970, they drop an absolute bomb.
Yeah.
They don't just file a complaint against the University of Maryland. They file a class action administrative complaint with the U.S. Department of Labor against an, quote, industry-wide pattern of sex discrimination across American higher education.
We really need to pause on that phrase, industry-wide pattern, because this represents a massive escalation in legal strategy. They were not playing small ball here.
Not at all.
They weren't saying, this one department head at Maryland is acting unfairly, please fix it. They were alleging that the entire enterprise of American higher education was systematically, purposefully built on illegal discrimination.
And they demanded action.
They demanded that the federal government conduct compliance reviews of every single institution holding a federal contract.
And the scale of the evidence she built to support this is staggering. I mean, think about doing this in 1969 and 1970.
Pre-internet.
Exactly. There were no spreadsheets, there were no email blasts, no quick internet searches. She is physically gathering data. She tracks down admissions quotas, finding out exactly how many women universities were deliberately allowing in.
Digging through paper records.
She looked at financial aid disparities, proving that fellowships were routinely reserved for men. She tracks hiring rates, promotion timelines, pay gaps. Over time, she and her allies filed specific, documented charges against roughly 250 colleges and universities.
250.
250. She built a literal mountain of empirical evidence.
The administrative endurance required to pull that off is just remarkable. Sandler inherently understood a fundamental truth about power, I think. Moral outrage is very easy for institutions to dismiss.
Oh, they do it all the time.
They can call you emotional or say it's an isolated incident or just a misunderstanding, but an aggregated, cross-referenced mountain of empirical data demonstrating structural violations of federal contracts.
You can't ignore that.
You really can't. That forces a bureaucratic response. She was ensuring that when this issue finally reached the halls of power, it could not be waved away as anecdotal.
But here is the limitation of that strategy, and this is where the story shifts. A box of 250 complaints sitting in a Department of Labor filing cabinet doesn't actually change the law.
Bureaucrats can drag their feet for years.
Decades even. If you have a mountain of evidence, you need a venue, you need a stage. You need someone with actual constitutional power to force a public reckoning. And that requires finding an ally on the inside.
Which introduces our second founder, Representative Edith Green.
The woman known as the mother of Title IX. She was a Democrat from Oregon, a former school teacher, and a deeply experienced member of the House of Representatives.
A veteran lawmaker.
Right. And in the summer of 1970, she was chairing the House Special Subcommittee on Education. And that summer, she convened 7 days of hearings specifically focused on discrimination against women in federally assisted education.
We cannot overstate the historical gravity of these hearings. I mean, before Edith Green brought her gavel down that summer, the systemic exclusion of women from educational opportunities had never been formally investigated by the United States Congress?
Never.
Never. It was considered a non-issue. The federal legislative branch simply did not view sex discrimination in education as a problem worthy of their time.
And the connection between Sandler and Green is incredibly direct here. Like, this wasn't a coincidence that Green started these hearings.
Not at all.
Green's hearings were triggered directly by Sandler's WEAL filings. Sandler literally sent Green the mountain of data and a curated list of witnesses.
She handed it to her.
She basically handed Representative Green a fully loaded, heavily researched congressional investigation, just ready to be fired.
It was a perfect political symbiosis. Sandler possessed the data, but completely lacked the institutional power to force anyone to look at it.
Right. She couldn't subpoena anyone.
Exactly. And Green possessed the institutional power, the gavel, the committee room, the authority to subpoena, the official congressional record. But she needed the undeniable documentary evidence to justify convening the hearings in the first place.
So they needed each other.
Together, they forced a private grievance into the public congressional record.
But Green wasn't just acting as a neutral judge or a benevolent facilitator here. She had her own profound personal grievances. Just like Sandler's radicalization happened in the faculty lounge, Green's happened in the halls of power.
She lived it every day.
She really did. As one of the very few women serving in Congress during that era, she had lived this reality every single day. She had watched women repeatedly shut out of policy discussions, passed over for committee chairmanships, and generally dismissed by the men around them.
The ultimate old boys club.
The ultimate, but more importantly, her time in Congress had taught her exactly how that old boys club operated. She knew how they killed bills they didn't like.
And that is a critical point regarding legislative survival. Having a righteous cause, or even having undeniable evidence, does not guarantee that a law will pass.
No.
In fact, in Washington, a highly visible righteous cause often guarantees a massive, well-funded counter-mobilization. Edith Green had survived in Congress by learning to read the room. She understood the mechanics of power, she knew when to pound the table and fight loudly, and she knew when to maneuver quietly in the shadows.
Which leads us to what I think is the most mind-blowing tactical move in this entire deep dive. When I read this in the sources, I actually had to stop and reread it to make sure I understood what happened.
It is brilliant.
It is. Once the actual language for Title IX was drafted and moving through the legislative process, Edith Green gave explicit advice to the women's advocates, including Sandler. She told them, under no uncertain terms, not to mount a public lobbying campaign. She told them to stay quiet.
She essentially ordered a complete stand-down of visible public pressure.
Wait, okay, I have to challenge this strategy.
Right.
This is so counterintuitive to everything we are taught about how civil rights victories happen.
We usually think of protests.
Right. We are taught that change requires a cultural mandate. You need loud, visible pressure. You need marches in the streets, picket signs, massive media attention, op-eds. You have to make so much noise that the system is terrified into listening. Why in the world would the mother of Title IX tell her own allies, the very feminists who gathered the 250 complaints, to just sit down and be quiet? Doesn't that risk the bill dying from apathy?
It's a really fair question, but I think it shows a misunderstanding of the specific political ecosystem of the early 1970s, which Green understood perfectly. Her reasoning was brilliantly pragmatic. She knew that visible pressure draws visible opposition.
Action and reaction.
Exactly. If feminists had started marching in the streets demanding a sweeping, unprecedented federal overhaul of higher education, it would have instantly become a highly polarized, partisan flashpoint.
Because it threatens the status quo.
Think about who they were up against. Universities would panic over the loss of their autonomy. Powerful athletic directors and alumni associations would panic over their football budgets. Traditionalists would panic over changing gender roles.
They would have freaked out.
They would have organized a massive, incredibly well-funded counter-lobbying effort, and they would have crushed the provision under the weight of controversy before it ever reached a floor vote.
Okay, I see. It's like if you want to sneak a highly disruptive line of code into a massive software update, you don't issue a flashy press release about that one specific line of code.
No, you don't.
You don't brag about it. You just embed it, let it ride in with the routine maintenance, and hope nobody reads the terms of service too closely until after they've already hit install.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Green recognized that the Title IX provision was relatively small in terms of word count, and it was attached to a much larger, more complex omnibus higher education bill.
So it could hide.
She knew that a quiet bill, standing in the shadows of major debates about student loans and institutional funding, had a far better chance of slipping through unnoticed. She bet that if the opposition didn't realize how transformative those 37 words were going to be, they wouldn't spend political cap-outs fighting them.
The irony here is just razor sharp. We are talking about a landmark piece of feminist legislation, a law that fundamentally reorganized American society, and it was steered to passage in large part by keeping feminists quiet.
By telling them to shh.
Literally.
Yeah.
By telling the loudest, most organized voices in the room to just shh, let the bureaucrats rubber stamp this, don't make a scene.
And the most remarkable part is that her cynical assessment of Congress was 100% correct. The stealth strategy worked.
It actually worked.
The provision moved through the committees and the chambers with far less controversy than it would ever generate in the years to come. By the time the law was enacted and universities suddenly woke up and realized they had to completely overhaul their admissions, their hiring, and their athletic funding models, the backlash was immense.
But it was too late.
Exactly. It was already federal law. Green's strategy successfully bypassed the institutional immune system of Capitol Hill.
Phenomenal political chess. She weaponized obscurity.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have Sandler providing the spark and the mountain of data. We have Green providing the venue, the hearings, and the stealth strategy. But we still need the actual words.
The text of the law.
Right. Green's committee needed a bill drafted. And to write the language that would fundamentally alter educational access, they needed someone who intimately knew exactly what it felt like to have those doors slammed in their face. Which brings us to our third founder, another Congresswoman, whose entire trajectory was shaped by a massive structural no.
We're speaking of Representative Patsy Mink.
A Democrat from Hawaii. And her biography alone is just astounding. She was the first woman of color and the first Asian American woman ever elected to the United States Congress.
A trailblazer in every sense.
But before she ever set foot in Washington, D.C., she experienced a crushing personal grievance, a rejection that was so absolute it altered the course of her life. Because she didn't want to be a politician initially. She wanted to be a doctor.
The human element here is really vital for understanding the eventual legislation. When we discuss federal law, it is very easy to abstract the beneficiaries into faceless demographic groups.
Yeah, just statistics.
But for Patsy Mink, educational exclusion was fiercely personal. She applied to medical school with the genuine, hard-earned aspiration of becoming a physician, and she was systematically rejected.
Now, when you dig into the historical record, there is a slight contested detail regarding exactly how many rejections she received. Different biographers and historical accounts vary on this. Some sources state she was rejected by more than a dozen medical schools. Other accounts put the number closer to 20.
Which is a very common occurrence in historical documentation, especially when you're dealing with personal correspondence and application letters from the 1940s. Memories fade, paper trails are incomplete.
Sure, things get lost.
But whether the precise count was 12, 15, or 20 is somewhat beside the point. The exact number does not change the underlying structural truth of what happened to her. The most important detail is the explicit nature of those rejections.
Because they weren't just standard rejections.
Right. Several of these medical institutions did not just send a generic, we regret to inform you letter. They told her plainly, in writing, that they were rejecting her application because they simply did not admit women.
Just imagine the sheer devastation of opening those letters. You have the grades, you have the drive, you have passed all the prerequisite hurdles, and you get a letter back saying, sorry, your gender disqualifies you from this entire profession.
It's brutal.
Not just one letter either. A chorus of a dozen or more institutions telling you that your biology makes your intellect totally irrelevant to them. It goes back to that feeling of the door being completely bricked over.
And it's a testament to her profound resilience that she didn't just accept the brick wall and give up. When the medical profession categorically rejected her, she executed a massive intellectual pivot. She redirected her ambition toward the law.
And she crushed it.
She succeeded brilliantly despite facing similar barriers. She graduated from the University of Chicago Law School in 1951, and notably, she was one of only 2 women in her entire graduating class.
2 women. That is staggering.
She then went on to become the first Japanese-American woman to practice law in Hawaii, and by 1965, she had fought her way into the U.S. Congress.
So she takes all of that lived experience, the sting of those dozen or 20 medical school rejection letters, the deep isolation of being one of only 2 women in her law school class, the constant hurdles of being a woman of color in a male-dominated political arena, and she channels it directly into her work as a principal house author of Title IX.
She was writing from experience.
She worked right alongside Edith Green to draft those 37 words.
For Patsy Mink, authoring this legislation was fundamentally an act of translation. It was described perfectly by historians as autobiography turned into statute.
I love that phrase.
It's so accurate. She was taking the exact structural door that had been slammed in her face, dismantling its hinges, and rebuilding it as a permanent legal guarantee for every girl who came after her.
I really want to pause on that concept, autobiography turned into statute. Because if you are listening right now trying to grasp the actual scale of this, how does one person's stack of rejection letters from the 1940s actually translate into the modern campus equality we see today?
It's a leap.
how do we mechanically get from a young woman in Hawaii being told she can't be a doctor to this massive federal framework?
If we connect this to the mechanics of institutional change, we have to look at how federal law utilizes leverage. Mink and her co-authors took a highly specific, highly personal grievance, the absolute refusal of medical or professional schools to admit women, and they extrapolated it into a broad, universal mandate.
They zoomed out.
By declaring that no person could be excluded from any education program receiving federal financial assistance on the basis of sex, they targeted the very mechanism that had derailed Mink's medical career.
Because it wasn't just about saying, hey, Harvard Medical School, you should probably let a few women in this year.
Exactly. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an existential threat to their funding. It fundamentally shifted the baseline. It meant that a university couldn't just have a restrictive quota allowing maybe 1 or 2 token female law students, which is what Mink experienced at Chicago.
Right.
And it meant they absolutely could not institute outright bans on female medical students. It forced an immediate structural shift. Universities that relied heavily on federal grants suddenly had to completely restructure their admissions criteria, ensuring that merit rather than gender was the deciding factor.
They had no choice.
It created the legal baseline for the campus equality that is so ubiquitous today that we almost take it for granted.
It's just incredibly powerful. She wrote the rule that would have saved her own dream, to save everyone else's. And the narrative arc of her life is actually sealed into the law itself, which is a very rare thing to see in American politics.
Very rare.
In 2002, tragically just weeks after her death, Congress formally renamed Title IX. It is officially known today as the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act.
That renaming is profoundly significant. It solidifies her historical role. Laws are occasionally named after their sponsors, but in this case, attaching her name to the law ensures that the personal suffering and the subsequent triumph of Patsy Mink remain forever attached to the doors she forced open.
It's permanent.
Her legacy is literally written into the code of American education.
It's a perfect closing of the circle. All right, so we've mapped out the House of Representatives side of this battle. We have Mink authoring it, pulling from her med school rejections. We have Green maneuvering it through committee, using her stealth strategy to avoid the lobbyists.
Right.
We have Sandler providing the initial spark. But as anyone who remembers their civics class knows, passing a bill in the House is only half the battle.
It has to go to the Senate.
Exactly.
Yes.
For a bill to become a unified national law, it needs a champion in the Senate. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because the Senate champion's motivations were entirely different from the female founders we've just discussed.
Yes. We must turn our attention to Senator Birch Bayh, a Democrat from Indiana. He was the legislation's chief sponsor in the Senate.
Let's lay out his timeline. He first introduced this anti-sex discrimination amendment to the higher education bill in August of 1971. Then, after various legislative hurdles, he reintroduced it a few months later on February 28, 1972, which is when the Senate finally passed it. But I have an observation here, and I want to push back on his inclusion in this specific narrative of lived humiliation.
Let's hear it.
So far, the clear through line of this entire deep dive has been personal pain. We talked about Bernice Sandler being told to her face she's too strong for a woman. We talked about Edith Green being marginalized by the old boys club.
Yes.
We talked about Patsy Mink being explicitly rejected by 20 medical schools. Those are raw, visceral, personal wounds. But Birch Bayh is a white male senator in the 1970s.
Establishment.
He's practically the definition of the American political establishment. He's never been denied a job or a school admission because of his gender.
Really?
So what is his personal stake in this fight? Why does he care so much about this 37-word provision?
It's a vital distinction to make, and it highlights how complex legislation gets passed. You need diverse coalitions. While Sandler, Green, and Mink were motivated by deeply lived personal humiliations, Bayh's motivation came from a completely different philosophical and strategic place.
So it wasn't personal for him.
Not in the same way. His commitment was heavily rooted in constitutional principles and grand legislative strategy. He wasn't looking at personal grievances. He was looking at the architecture of American civil rights.
So he wasn't trying to fix a specific door that slammed in his face. He was looking at the blueprint of the whole house and noticing it was structurally unsound.
Precisely. And to truly understand Senator Bayh's role, we have to look at his other major legislative priority at the time. Birch Bayh was the Senate's leading sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA,
Oh, okay.
The ERA, as many listeners will know, was a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution designed to explicitly guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. It was the white whale of the feminist movement.
Right. And the ERA was a massive, highly visible, incredibly contentious battle. It was the exact opposite of Edith Green's stealth strategy.
Indeed. And by early 1972, while the Title IX legislation was being navigated through the committees, the ERA was bogged down. It was facing incredibly stiff headwinds.
Why was it failing?
Because a constitutional amendment is a massive target. Opponents of the ERA were highly organized. They argued that guaranteeing absolute gender equality in the Constitution would lead to women being drafted into military combat, or that it would completely upend traditional family structures, alimony laws, and workplace protections.
The usual panic.
Right. Bayh deeply believed that the Constitution needed to explicitly guarantee gender equality. But as a pragmatist, he also recognized that constitutional amendments take years, sometimes decades, to ratify, and they require a massive cultural consensus that he simply didn't have in 1972.
So what does he do? He initiates a proxy war. This is brilliant legislative maneuvering.
It is.
Bayh realized that if he couldn't get the whole pie, the constitutional amendment right now, he was going to take a very large, very consequential slice. He used the higher education bill on the Senate floor to advance a core piece of the ERA's principle by statute, rather than waiting for the constitutional amendment.
Exactly. He viewed Title IX as an education-specific guarantee. If women could not yet have explicit constitutional protection against all forms of sex discrimination across all facets of American life, he would ensure, by federal law, that they could at least not be excluded from educational opportunities.
Because education is easier to defend.
Education was a softer target. It was viewed as a universal good, making it much harder for conservatives to argue against than, say, drafting women into the infantry. For Senator Bayh, Title IX was essentially a down payment on equality.
A down payment on equality. I really love that phrasing.
It was a statutory bridge, advancing the cause materially while the larger constitutional battle raged on.
It highlights a massive legal shift that occurred through this process. Let's clarify that shift for the listener. We started this story with Bernice Sandler using an executive order to file complaints.
Right.
And we ended with Bayh, Green, and Mink passing a permanent federal law. Mechanically, what is the difference between an executive order and a statute, and why does it matter so much?
It matters because an executive order is inherently fragile. An executive order is simply a directive from the sitting president instructing federal agencies on how to manage their operations.
So it's just the president's instructions?
Yes. It has the force of law, but it can be modified, weakened, or completely revoked by the stroke of a pen by the very next president who takes office. It relies entirely on the political will of the current administration to enforce it.
So if a new president came into power who didn't care about university equality or wanted to appease traditionalist voters, Sandler's whole strategy, all 250 complaints, could have been wiped out overnight with a single signature.
Exactly, and that is why the legislative work of Green, Mink, and Bayh was so critical. They took the vulnerability of an executive order and the administrative momentum it generated, and they forged it into a permanent statute.
A real law.
A federal law passed by both chambers of Congress is incredibly difficult to undo. It requires another act of Congress majorities in the House and Senate, plus the president's signature, to repeal it. By moving the battleground from the executive branch to the legislative branch, they permanently, solidly altered the legal landscape.
And the culmination of that monumental shift happened on June 23, 1972, when President Richard Nixon signed the higher education bill carrying those 7 words into law.
The finish line.
We've officially moved from "you come on too strong in a faculty lounge" to a binding national mandate.
It is a remarkable trajectory. But as we reflect on this entire timeline, we have to recognize that this legal shift was not accomplished by these 4 individuals operating in a vacuum.
Right. It was a relay race, not a solo sprint. We spent a lot of time profiling the 4 headline founders, Sandler, Green, Mink, and Bayh, but the history makes it explicitly clear that they were heavily supported by a vast ecosystem of advocates.
The unsung heroes.
Behind these 4 figures stood massive feminist networks that actually made their legislative work possible.
We mentioned WHEEL earlier, the Women's Equity Action League. We need to credit their institutional support. They provided Bernice Sandler with the organizational letterhead, the legal resources, and the network required to file those massive class action complaints.
She couldn't do it alone.
Without WHEEL, Sandler is just a lone, disgruntled professor with a grievance. With WHEEL, she's a national legal threat.
And it wasn't just WHEEL. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, was incredibly active here. NOW and WHEEL worked in tandem, pressing complaints against scores of institutions across the country, constantly keeping the pressure on the Department of Labor and continuously feeding that pipeline of documentary evidence to Edith Green's committee.
And we must also acknowledge the broader historical groundwork laid even earlier by the President's Commission on the Status of Women, established by JFK, and the various state commissions it spawned.
They set the stage.
These earlier efforts had already produced the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and they were instrumental in ensuring that sex was included as a protected category in the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964.
It's like they were constantly preparing the soil. Every previous battle, every previous piece of data gathered made the next legislative leap slightly more possible.
We must balance the historical record. The individual lawmakers, Green, Mink, Bayh, were brilliant strategists and devoted advocates. But without these grassroots organizations tirelessly pressing complaints and gathering data against hundreds of institutions, the lawmakers simply wouldn't have had the necessary evidentiary record to justify the law to their skeptical male colleagues.
They needed the proof.
The politicians needed the undeniable paper trail that the networks provided. It was a true symbiotic relationship between grassroots activism and high-level legislative maneuvering.
So we have the spark of Sandler's data, the venue of Green's committee, the translation of Mink's personal tragedy into statute, the Senate proxy war led by Bayh, and the networks providing the fuel.
All working together.
It all results in these 37 words. But I want to bring this entirely back to the listener right now. For you, listening to this deep dive, how did those 37 words actually change the reality of education? We've talked about the law, but can you synthesize the massive institutional changes this created? What does Title IX actually look like on a modern campus today?
The mechanism of change was elegantly simple, but brutally effective. It weaponized federal funding.
Follow money.
Always. The law essentially said to universities, you are absolutely free to continue discriminating based on sex. But if you do, you will not receive a single dime of federal money.
Ouch.
Because modern universities are massively dependent on federal grants, federally backed student loans, and research funding to keep their lights on, compliance was not optional. It was a matter of sheer institutional survival.
You hit them where it hurts, the wallet. If you threaten a university's endowment or operating budget, they will change their morals real quick.
Precisely. And the impact was an immediate forced overhaul of the entire academic infrastructure. First, it changed admissions policies overnight. Universities that previously had strict quotas limiting female enrollment, or professional schools that banned women entirely, like Patsy Mink experienced, had to open their doors based purely on academic merit.
It's huge.
Second, it radically altered faculty hiring and promotion guidelines, addressing the very grievance Bernice Sandler faced. Universities had to prove they were hiring and tenuring women fairly. Third, it restructured the distribution of financial aid and scholarships, ensuring women had equal access to the capital needed for higher education.
And of course, the most visible revolution, which nobody really saw coming at the time, was athletics.
Yes. Eventually, the courts and regulators interpreted Title IX to mandate equitable funding, facilities, and opportunities for female athletes. It forced universities to fund women's sports programs, which completely revolutionized American athletics and created generations of female athletes.
It's just wild to think about. If you walk onto any university campus today, you see the living legacy of this law everywhere. You see it in the ratio of the student body. You see it in the law schools and the medical schools, where women now frequently make up more than half the class.
A reality that would have been unimaginable to Patsy Mink in 1948.
Exactly. You see it in the stadiums, the locker rooms, and the research labs. It is the essential load-bearing backbone for modern university gender equality. Every single time a female student receives a federal Pell Grant, or steps onto a varsity soccer field, or gets accepted into a graduate program without her gender being held against her, she is walking through a door that was pried open by these specific founders.
It is a profound realization. The baseline of fairness that we expect today was not inevitable. It was not a natural evolution of society. It was constructed.
Built brick by brick.
And it was constructed specifically because people who were told no refused to accept that answer as final.
Let's wrap this up, because this has been an incredible journey. We started with ordinary no's, a lost job promotion, an ignored female colleague, a rejected medical school application. And we saw how those raw grievances were gathered, quantified, and stacked high enough by Bernice Sandler and the feminist networks like Wheel.
To build an undeniable case.
We saw how they were routed through the right congressional channels by Edith Green's brilliant, quiet maneuvering. We saw how Patsy Mink translated her own pain into a universal shield for future generations. And we saw how Birch Bayh used it as a strategic leap forward for constitutional equality. Together, they forged 37 words that shattered the educational status quo in America.
It is a masterclass in how institutional change actually happens. It is almost never just a lightning bolt of justice from the sky. It is meticulous, often tedious, highly strategic work fueled by very personal fires. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over regarding how that work is done today.
Oh, I like where this is going. Lay it on us.
We spent significant time discussing Representative Edith Green and how she used silence and obscurity as a weapon. She deliberately advised activists not to lobby loudly so the bill could pass without triggering a massive opposition campaign from universities and traditionalists.
The stealth strategy.
It worked brilliantly, resulting in one of the most impactful laws in American history. But if we connect that to the bigger picture of our world today, it raises a really uncomfortable question.
Which is?
In today's world where every single grievance is instantly broadcasted, debated, and lobbied for loudly on social media, where visibility is considered the ultimate currency of activism, are we actually making institutional change harder? By constantly demanding the spotlight and cultural consensus for every single cause, do we inadvertently summon the exact opposition that Edith Green successfully avoided? It makes you wonder, what modern revolution, what truly transformative piece of policy might be quietly slipping into a boring administrative contract right now, simply because no one is making any noise about it?
Wow. That is a lot to think about. Maybe the loudest revolution isn't always the most effective one. Maybe the real change is happening in the boring, unread footnotes while everyone else is arguing on the timeline. I love that.
It's food for thought.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away with a new appreciation for the history hidden behind the rules we take for granted today. Remember that the next time you face an unfair no, you might just be one step away from rewriting the rules entirely. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.